The first 2 days of COP26 were full of promises, as heads of states from across the globe made lofty promises about enhanced action on climate change. But inaction seems to be the order of the day as the conference inches towards its finale. Reading the COP26 Presidency's Zero Draft, or the possible outcomes of the Glasgow Climate Change Summit, presents a good idea of the course of the conference and where they are heading.
Earlier last week, it was encouraging to hear leaders reiterate their commitment to achieving goals of the Paris Agreement, including limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and increasing abilities to adapt to impacts of climate change. The LDC group, however, remains concerned that some countries' actions are not aligning with the statement made, and there remain apparent disconnect between the ambition of public statements and what is happening inside the negotiations.
While the draft talks about keeping temperatures from rising beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, it has no mention of fossil fuels, let alone setting a date by when the world will get rid of it completely. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the world can only emit about 400 gigatons of CO2 equivalent starting 2020. But at the current rate of emissions, which is 36.4 gigatons CO2, this carbon budget will be exhausted by 2030. Under the current scenario, 7 developed countries, the US, UK, EU27, Russia, Japan, Australia, and Canada will hog 29% of the carbon budget by 2030, while China alone will take up 33%, leaving just 38% for the rest of the world in this period. Will the Glasgow conference be able to curtail fossil fuel emissions? Probably not.
We have heard many parties support inclusion of calling for an end for fossil fuel subsidies in major economies and to accelerate clear implementation pathways. The UNFCCC needs a more robust process to address distortions that heighten social and economic risks of the transition. Colleagues, I refer to the trillions of dollars in subsidies provided to the fossil fuel industry since the Paris Agreement's adoption. Meanwhile, a meager $2 billion per year is available through the UN's climate funds.
But the big disappointment is about finance, which developed countries had promised at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. This was a $100 billion per year pledge made by the developed countries to the developing countries to help them adapt to and mitigate climate change. This money was to be made available from 2020. This amount itself is paltry, as latest studies have shown that the world will need close to $5 trillion a year to cope with climate change. This includes money not just for adaptation and mitigation, but also for capacity building, protecting forests, and most importantly, compensate for loss and damage arising out of climate change to the most vulnerable countries. But the developed countries have not even been able to mobilize this inadequate sum of money.
Commitment of developed countries under the convention is to provide, rather than simply to mobilize resources, which are two very different things. We are disappointed that developed countries are unwilling to discuss long-term finance matters, which means that the current $100 billion goal, which was adopted under the COP, but is unfulfilled, cannot be assessed either by the COP itself or under the convention. In reality, it is an empty commitment.
One of the talking points about this conference has been about net zero targets that many countries announced on the run-up or during the conference. The COP presidency's Zero Draft also acknowledges net zero emission targets. But as experts point out, most of these net zero targets have been set when the world would have already crossed the 1.5 degree temperature rise threshold. There is a good chance that Glasgow will be remembered for gaveling these net zero targets. But will it also be remembered for achieving a net zero on stopping climate change?